Hi, everybody, and welcome back. We're kicking off the next session of the ICCO Summit with an interview with Sir Martin Sorrell. I am not going to bother with a lengthy introduction because I suspect that everybody in the audience knows Martin's background, his story, and his expertise. And we're going to jump right in to one of the most critical issues of the day, the American election. Now, Martin was telling me as we met up before this session that if I'd gotten to him a week or so ago, he would have predicted a narrow Biden victory, but a very hard fight. Where do you stand now, Martin? What do you think is going to happen? Is somebody going to win? Are the voters going to decide, or is the Supreme Court going to decide? Where do
the president decided a few hours ago that we should stop counting the votes.
I'm not sure he gets to do that.
He threatened to go to the Supreme Court as well. He said before he was going to flood the place with lawyers. But on a more serious note, I mean, he has done. God knows what this means for the polling industry. Total abject failure, I guess, for the third time in a row, really. And we've seen Brexit misforecast. We've seen the first Trump victory misforecast. This one, you said to me, Paul, you think Biden has a path to victory. I mean, what I'm getting here, and it's early morning here. I did manage to get an hour or so sleep, but it seems to me that Trump has an easier road to victory now, or multiple roads. Nevada is seemingly very important, as is Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So we have to see how it shakes out. These late ballots are clearly the early voting, which tended to be more democratic. But let me just say two things that came to me this morning, or the evening before I went to bed briefly, and when I got up. The first was, I remember a session with the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago. It was a conference, and there was a sort of green room session for a few people, and there was a very bright reporter, a woman who'd been following the Trump campaign, and I said to her, this was after the Brad Parscale story, where he had this breakdown in Florida. You remember Parscale Gibbs was the agents in San Antonio, Texas, that had done a lot of data work in the first campaign in 2016 and was linked with Cambridge Analytica, but was interesting from the point of view of targeting, etc. And Parscale had got off the road. He was caught off the rails. He was caught outside his house in his underpants with his wife in a state of dudgeon. Anyway, I asked the reporter, why was it that the Trump campaigns seemed to be in such disarray? And she said, far from it. What the Trump campaign had been doing, and they were much better than the Democrats, was been focusing on the 90 million or so people who don't vote. Last time round, it was actually about 135 million, I think, or 130 million who voted. And she said, about 150 million people who vote, and there are 90 million who don't. And the Trump campaign was highly focused from a data point of view on that 90 million group didn't vote. Now, one of all the things the commentators are saying on ABC and CNN and everything is that what's happened here has been a high turnout, and Trump has got a large number of those votes. So the conventional wisdom is high turnout favors Democrats. Well, that may be wrong. That was one thing I remember this morning. The other thing was a Sunday Times reporter, another woman on the Andrew Marr show, was interviewed, and she said she'd been at one of the Trump rallies, and it was, when you see it live, it's very different to see it when you report it on television. It's almost like the Trump is a TV host, which he obviously is, or has historically been, and his timing and his comic timing was really excellent. So those sort of two images sort of sit in my mind, particularly the first, which I think, has real implications for what we do as an industry, that, a data-driven, if this is accurate, a data-driven approach which picks up the data, analyzes it, and gets the insights, is the way to go. So as I sit here now at what about 5:30 in the morning here, 10:30 London time, it looks to me as though Trump has, let's say, multiple. Before this started, Trump had a narrow way to 270. It seems Biden has the narrow way to 270. It doesn't mean he can't do it. It's very close to call. There'll be some recounts in some states, clearly, but it's amazingly close. And for the polling industry, it's a complete disaster.
I want to push back on that a little bit quickly. You and I disagree about the path to victory thing, but that's fine. But Biden, the states that are uncalled, that quote unquote matter. All right, let's assume that Maine is eventually going to go to Biden.
Yeah, there's that one congressional district in Maine,
but it's
that conflict with the Republicans.
Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Biden is narrowly behind in all of those states, but people would expect, I think, the late count to favor Biden.
Yeah.
If Biden does win all of those states, certainly a possibility, then 538, the premier polling site in America, would have gotten every race right except Florida, which Florida's just a giant cluster bomb right now. But that would not be a humiliation for the polling industry. But therefore, but I did see what I thought was a remarkable sort of thing, where one of the 538 pollsters had been trying to reach 100,000 Trump voters. And he'd started out with a list of 100,000 names. He had reached out to all of them. Something like 100 had responded to his request for information. And he got, at the end of the day, 6 usable responses out of 100,000. There is clearly a population out there that coincides heavily with the kind of people who vote for Trump. And because this is a global conference, other populist leaders.
Well, I mean,
incredibly difficult to reach and quantify.
That's a really important point. I always remember there's a guy called Andrew Keane who's a journalist, and I remember him telling me 3 months ago that he'd driven his daughter across the country because she was going to school. He's based in California. He drove across the East Coast, I think to Philadelphia, if I remember rightly. And he said what was remarkable, that he couldn't see a Biden flag or poster in sight when he drove across. So, it seems to me, whichever way it goes, whether it goes to Biden on a narrow victory or to, one thing is, it seems to be the case that the Senate will not go to the Democrats.
Yeah.
The House of Representatives will go to the Democrats. And there's a question about president. So it's not going to be a blue wave. Whatever you think, the populist movement, it doesn't seem to me the electorate have blamed Trump for COVID. They blame COVID and jobs, the economy. I was very struck in the last few days by the lack of urgency in the Biden campaign. Quite apart from the gaffes that the press, obviously the right-wing press in particular, jump on. Yesterday with his granddaughter and his son, and this misnaming. Now, I know there's a lot of pressure, and there's been the polling and the campaigning. It takes a huge physical and mental toll. Anyway, look, it's fascinating stuff. What it means, I don't know. For stability, I don't know. To have the president, of course, come out and say, stop the voting. Mike Pence immediately came out with a sort of more conciliatory statement and said we had to count all the votes. But think what you will, it is amazing what he has managed to do. Trump has managed to do from a popular vote point of view in relation to the polling. And I think the biggest thing, despite what you say about 538 or whatever, the biggest thing is the polling industry needs to look at its navel.
Yeah. What about the advertising industry or advertising? Because one of the other storylines that we might get to is that the Democrats outraised the Republicans by
Yes.
many, many millions of dollars, spent many, many millions more on television advertising.
Right.
Is this definitive proof that television advertising is not effective in the political realm? And can brands and corporations take a lesson from that as well?
Well, you know, I'm trying to remember the name. His name, Tommy, the Alabama football coach who won.
Tuberville.
Yeah,
Tommy
that's right.
Tuberville.
He won, and of course he was against a Democrat who was spending very heavily. And his speech was, "This proves that the people of Alabama voted because their vote can't be bought." Look, I think what it points to, Paul, I think Sir's point is I go back to that comment from the Wall Street Journal reporter, this focus on the data on the 90 million or whatever it was of people who don't vote, and going against the conventional wisdom that if you manage to mobilize the people that don't vote, that's good for the Democrats. It's clearly been better in this particular case, whatever the result is, for the Republicans. And I think what it tells you is that the targeted, data-driven approach on which you build creative, and I'm talking my own book here because this is the S4 Capital model.
I would have expected nothing less.
The data-driven approach, where you devise creative on the basis of that data with the insights, test it out because it may not be right. I think it just goes to prove that targeted communication, and I think in two senses, I think not only from a marketing point of view, I mean, this is not new stuff. This goes back to David Ogilvy and one-to-one marketing and Ogilvy Direct and those early days. It really sort of, to me, points out the way that technology has changed the game and how marketing has changed the game. And what you produce may not be perfect, but you test it out, you see what the response is, and then you calibrate and get a better response by using personalization at scale. So that's at one level. The other level, which is a sort of COVID-related comment, I was very struck by a presentation by, I think his name is Joe Fuller at Harvard Business School, professor there, who focuses on working from home and the implications of it, and obviously COVID has made that. And his last slide is a picture of a large number of people, and rather like direct marketing or one-to-one marketing, he implies that the firm increasingly will be regarded as a collection of individuals rather than a firm, and that you will have to target your HR, talent, whatever you want to call it, programs on a much more individualized basis. So if people want to work from home more, if they want to be in the office for 2, 3, or 4 days, if they want a variable commuting, if they want dispersed working, this demands a very different approach. So I think there's really interesting parallels as to what we've been doing or trying to do on the marketing side of the equation, and what we will try to do as you try and build a firm. And we at S4 now, we're about 2,900 people. With the recent win, we'll be up to 33,000, and then we have something else coming along where we're going to recruit another 300 people. So we'll be up to about 3,300 people, and I think that's not an enormous size. Certainly not the size of the holdcos or of Accenture or whatever. We have 500,000 people, but I do think it means that we will have to take a much more individualized approach to what we do, and so I think there are great parallels between what's happening on the demand side, if you like, and what's happening on the supply side.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID, because certainly it's the background against which everything else, including the election, is taking place right now. It seems to have changed work habits, shopping habits, media consumption habits. Are those changes temporary or permanent? And what do they mean for our business going forward?
Well, I don't think they've changed anything. I think they've accelerated. So, for example, I was having lunch on Sunday with an architect, and a property developer came up and said, I won't say who, and he says, I wouldn't bet against cities. You know, London will come back, and the architect who is an academic as well and works on smarter cities. We talked about it, and I think he was more sympathetic to my view, which is that the property developer or the advisor to the property developer is going to have a real problem, because I think cities are going to change. I think New York. You know, I'm in New York, and New York is very quiet. Hopefully, it will stay quiet despite what happened this morning or early morning. But I think the nature of New York will change. I know that people say, well, you know, I remember when I graduated from business school in '68, you couldn't give apartments away in New York. You couldn't give a house away in the Hamptons. You know, I was talking to somebody from LA who said, you know, the whole of Beverly Hills is up for sale at the moment. I think you're going to see some fundamental shifts. You know, Denver, Austin, a state like Utah, Montana, Wyoming, I mean, Colorado, all these will become more interesting. I'm not saying that you'll see massive floods of people, but for people who can do dispersed working, you know, if you're a software programmer, why would you, I mean, people at the big tech platforms have said, one of them said that to me earlier this week, you know, for those jobs which can be done remotely, you know, our people, we tend to be on the younger side. Our media people, we have about 600 data and analytics and media people, 700. They tend to, they're about 28 average, and then the content side about 2,200 now. They're basically around 32, 33. Now, a lot of them, not a lot of them, some of them live with their parents, some of them live on their own, some of them live as couples, some of them married couples, some with children, some without. And resources, you know, I'm in a fairly privileged position. I have resources, I have flexibility, but I think the general drift is they want more flexibility. So these are things, Paul, that have been in the hopper all the time. And I get this guy on Sunday, you know, after the property developer departed from our conversation, to agree with me that these things have been there. So consumer online shopping, essentials, you know, 1/3 of US households are ordering essentials and groceries for the first time as a result of COVID. It's like SARS and the Chinese consumer. That was a bellwether event. Alan Jope at Unilever, when he was running Unilever China, often quotes that the Chinese consumer changed. But these were trends in the wind. So online education, online communication, live events, that's one thing. Media. The trends in the media, you know, newspapers and magazines are being eviscerated, certainly in their old form, you know, felling trees and distributing newsprint, which isn't a profitable thing to do, and neither is it environmentally friendly. It's shifted the balance yet again, even more so, to online. You know, the streamers, your comments about TV and TV spending, I mean, it's going to raise questions in people's minds about what is the most effective way of reaching consumers. Right. Their varied preferences and their different purchase preferences and media preferences. So that's the second area on media. And then the third is on enterprise. And I think our clients are much more willing to change, and change is painful. You know, we see it all today. I woke up this morning, I was reading some stuff. Clearly, when somebody makes a very significant change in direction, you know, an analog company starts to digitize itself, transform itself much more aggressively, that causes tremendous ripples, and the established forces don't like it. You know, the holdcos in our industry don't like the shifting sands. You know, I tried to run one for 33 years, and it's difficult. If you have an analog business, it's an albatross around your neck, and the heads of all the heads of the holdcos are dealing with it. You know, in the PR area, interestingly, we were talking about it before we came on air. The PR area has been probably, of all of them, apart from the tech and healthcare clients, which have been remarkably buoyant, the PR sides of Omnicom, of IPG, of WPP have done best. And, you know, those were regarded a few years ago as the weakest part, or one of the weakest parts.
I have a question in the chat box here from Nikhil Khanna, a perfectly reasonable request. I would like to hear Sir Martin's views on the PR and comms industry, given that this is a PR conference. That seems entirely reasonable. I have a couple of questions building on what you just said, because as you look at winners and losers from the COVID situation, it seems to me that PR has slightly outperformed some of the other disciplines. It seems to me that independents and more nimble firms have slightly outperformed holding companies. You mentioned
not
earlier,
not slightly, dramatically, I would
okay.
say. You know, our results for the Q3 are going to come out next Monday. You'll see. I mean, the gap in we don't regard the holding companies as being our competition. You know, the analogs to us, or the companies that we compare ourselves with, are the tech companies.
I was going to ask you about the consulting shops and whether you felt people like Accenture, who you mentioned earlier, have been able to gain any kind of advantage.
Accenture are running into exactly the same. You know, they buy these so-called creative companies. Some are creative, like Droga. They leave them on their own, which is, I think, the bill of goods that they sell them to make, you know, David or whoever comfortable with a strategic direction that is totally opposed. You know, it's 180 degrees away from what they talk about before when they were independent. But put that to one side. You know, they're just being extremely practical. You know, Droga had peaked and was on its way down a little bit. I think their revenues were off for about 10% in America when they sold, and they got rid of a number of people. So it was already on the downstroke, but they leave them separate. So, you know, in Germany, they have a Cole Rebbe and a Sina Schrader, a Shackleton, the Monkeys. I mean, becomes a collection of brands, and it's incoherent. It's an incoherent approach. Now, it may be that over time it will be proved to be the best way of doing it. I don't know, but I've got to tell you that from what we see when we compete against them, they don't get, you know, in the couple of things that we've gone head to head with them, we have won, and we're a peanut, a pimple in comparison to an elephant. I think that Accenture suffers from exactly the same issues that the whole case. It's the law of big numbers, and you know, the bigger you are, the tougher it gets. And I think that's it. The whole goes on the PR and comms industry, and I've said this before and drawn a little bit of flack for it. But I think what's interesting about the PR industry is the leaders of the big PR companies are trying to position their firms. There was an article, I don't know whether it was in PR Week or where, a couple of days ago, about how the leaders were trying to position themselves post-COVID as more advertising agencies or media agencies or whatever it happened to be. And I think that's a terrible problem for the whole coast, because, you know, if you're Mark Reed, you have, you know, Hill and Knowlton, you have BCW, and I mention them because I know them fairly well. You have the specialist agencies as well, all of whom are trying to become like quasi-advertising agencies, whether it's a pure traditional agency like a JWT or a one I used to be, or as a brand new digital agency as they slam together Wonderman with JWT and VML with Y&R. It becomes even more messy because they have more competition internally, and the thing that kills the holding companies is their lack of a unitary structure. So combining the assets in an effective way, I think, is the critical issue. And if the PR companies, you know, if I was running a PR agency, that's the direction I would take it. It's the right direction to go. Yeah, but in a holding company structure, Paul, it makes no sense. All you're doing is creating more. I think
you've probably heard me say more than once that, you know, I think things like advertising and digital are perfectly legitimate tools for the public relations process, and that a more integrated approach. I'm not sure I'd say we're becoming more like ad agencies, but we're using all the tools available to us.
Well, I think the phrase public relations is not a great phrase. There has to be, in a an online 24/7 real-time world, whether you call them social media agencies or search and social or e-commerce or whatever you call them. The word public relations, and I said this before, and as I say, drew flack for it, connotes old-fashioned analog, as opposed to where I think the industry is trying to go rightly, which is to embrace the technology. I mean, it's understanding Google and Facebook and Amazon and Tencent and Alibaba and TikTok and Apple and Microsoft and Adobe and Oracle and Salesforce and IBM and SAP and Twitter and Snap and Pinterest and LG and Samsung and Spotify and Netflix and Baidu and Epic and all these companies and Xiaomi. You have to understand those companies. That's where the future is. And again, in COVID, what is one of the lessons of COVID? It's the tech companies that have been continued to be expansive during a very difficult time. Our revenues bottomed in April with 3% growth, and we've seen sequential growth all the way through to September. And October looks as though it will follow that direction too. So we're back to where we were pre-COVID.
Let's talk about those tech companies for a while, and because clearly there have been huge winners in the technology sector throughout the COVID epidemic. But how real do you think the possibility of a global tech lash is? And how vulnerable are companies like Google to antitrust and other regulatory action around the world, in the US and in Europe and elsewhere?
Well, if for example, Biden has an easier path, probably there will be more challenges on the regulatory front in the US for the tech companies. If Trump has his way, probably less. If you look at it internationally, probably the temperature is rising. I don't think breaking them up is going to do you much good. I think if you look, really interesting, you look at the third quarter messaging around the results of Facebook and indeed Amazon and Google, they are, I think, doing the right thing. They're positioning themselves increasingly as the engines of small business. I mean, Alibaba, interesting, Jack Ma is again in the news with the delay or the possible delay of the Ant Financial IPO, which would have been the biggest, or will be, if it does go ahead, the biggest IPO that we've seen, $35 billion IPO. But Jack Ma is interesting because he always positions Alibaba as the engine of growth for small business, the Chinese entrepreneur. And I think what's increasingly is becoming, and I think it's a very smart move by the tech platforms, is they're increasingly, you see a Google advertising campaign around small businesses here. For example, in the UK, I saw a couple of campaigns that positions Google around small business, Amazon the same, Facebook the same. And that, I think they failed to do that historically. So when the regulators go after them, if they do, be careful what you wish for, because 60 to 70% of their ad revenues come from those things, for those companies. So for example, in this second lockdown, or this further lockdown that we have in the UK, the salvation for the small and medium-sized companies that are going to be under immediate and severe pressure, despite elongating the furloughs, that the salvation will be to use the tech platforms for selling goods and services. The salvation is not ITV. Going back to your commentary on free-to-air TV, that's too inflexible. I remember, this is a salutary lesson for traditional media. When COVID hit, a lot of clients were really, really upset that they were penalized for dropping or they could be penalized for dropping their their television media commitments. So if you had booked TV time, and because of COVID, you wanted to withdraw it because it made no sense because you had no distribution, you got fined, effectively, penalized. That's wrong. I mean, this is a MAC in a way, a material adverse change, and they get whacked. So our clients come away from COVID thinking traditional media is far too inflexible and not adaptable enough.
Right. And
of course, on the flip side of that, all the new media, in terms of absolute costs, are less. In terms of flexibility, of great. As somebody from one of the tech platforms said to me last night when I was having a conversation with him about this point, he said, welcome to the world of traditional media. It is too inflexible. The upfronts, which maybe as a result of COVID will disappear. Procter, I think, have taken a view that they won't participate in the upfronts. I mean, these are artificial events in today's 24/7 always-on environment.
Okay. So I have a bunch of questions here, which I'm going to try and sort of bring down to one. So the first one came from Gerd Pierboom, who wants to know whether you think the communications sector underestimated the COVID pandemic, and particularly underestimated the opportunities that might be presented. Then I have a question from Lukasz Michalski, who says that PR firms, according to the ICCO report, are investing in social and influencer marketing and looking for profits outside of their, I guess, traditional core business. Is that a smart move? And then there's a question from Cara Burkett about employment in the PR and communications business and what the implications are there. So if I can sort of bundle all that together and get your feeling on what are the opportunities, where should we be investing, and what's the future for PR jobs? I think that would be
I think I don't encourage competition, but it's the same. It's 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago. I sat down and said I wanted to go for growth. Let's assume that we're averagely intelligent, pushing on an open door. So the three areas where, even at WPP at that time when our portfolio was flat, not down as it is now, but flat, there were three areas of growth: first-party data, digital advertising content, and digital media. Simple. So that to me. So when that second question about seeing the growth in search and influencer, whether that exactly the right areas, whether there are more areas or not, which I think there are. I think if you think about it that way, I think that's the right move for the holdcos. That creates tremendous problems, because it means that PR companies become the same as advertising agencies. They become more sort of commodified, if you like, as a result. In terms of taking advantage of COVID, I mean, what we did, and COVID really hit. And I was talking to somebody from the tech platforms again last night, and what was really interesting is, she said that the low point for them, and it was the same for us, was the last 2 weeks in March. We bottomed in terms of like-for-like sales growth at 3% in April, and in March it was, I think, 5%, and that's like-for-like growth. And that was the nadir, if you like, or that was the bottom. What did we do? We pivoted, and I got to say, our people, our team, and Victor and Wes and Chris and Pete were brilliant in pivoting to virtual events, converting live events to virtual events. We tech companies, that's how they sell their products and services. So switching that was one. Robotic production. We joked when we acquired Caramel Pictures in Amsterdam, assets purchase a year or so ago, that Victor Knapp said, we've acquired more robots than people, and we had robotic production. And then the third area was animation, which went off vertically. You talk to anybody in Hollywood, it went vertical at the beginning of April. So the lesson is adapting your revenue streams, not looking at your boots, and adapting your revenue streams. So on the question about people, and we've increased our number of people in our business in the first 6 months of this year by about 22%. And you'll see next week, the first 9 months, it's even better than that. And as a result of winning some business, we'll be adding very significantly to our base. I think the holding companies have created a very difficult position. Maybe the PR companies within the holding companies, because they've had less revenue compression, maybe more like in Q3, instead of being down, let's say 5 to 10%, or because actually Omnicom was down 8% at the net revenue. So let's say 5 to 10%, instead of being down by that, the PR companies have been down by 2 or 3 or 4%. So their compression was less. So maybe they could manage their book. The leader of H&K and the leader of BCW, for example, inside WPP, could fight their corner better and were less interfered with by the accountants at the center because they had relatively better performance. I do think. Just one thing, we have a responsibility to increase the opportunities for our people. And I think one of the downsides of technology, and I don't want to appear to be a Luddite, but I do think advanced technology decreases employment prospects, not increases it. So I see our role, our social role, if you like, as being very much to increase employment opportunities for our people. Sorry.
No. I was going to say, one of the other things we found in the PR industry is we did a rolling survey throughout the year, was that actually at the beginning of the crisis, there was a lot of opportunity in areas that had been neglected for quite a while. For example, we saw a fairly steep decline in some of the brand marketing activity, which had previously been very bullish, moving into corporate reputation, employee communications, crisis management, and those areas. Was that a blip because of the circumstances in March and April, or do you think that signals that those things are perhaps more important than they had been treated by a lot of companies in recent years?
I think those areas, crisis communications, for example, M&A, they're higher margin in my experience. I mean, those businesses that specialize in crisis and M&A, there's an uncanny sort of mathematical rule. I remember we always used to talk about it, that once a business got to about $60 million in terms of revenue, like the one center business in New York or in London or in Berlin or wherever it is, they sort of bottomed out, or they're not bottomed out, they topped out. And they couldn't go any further. And I think the reason is those businesses depend on individuals. They are lifestyle businesses. Those individuals, fund their living and their expenses out of these businesses, and they fund their whatever their sort of business objectives are. They may have, they may be interested in certain political campaigns or getting involved in certain political events, and that's how they operate. But these businesses don't have scale, and because they're based, that you get to that 60 million and it's very difficult. And if you're running something in London and you suddenly disappear off to New York, and a client calls you and in London and says, "Where are you?" You've gone and you can't handle it. So I think there are some scale issues that make those businesses very difficult to scale. There are a number of them. Private equity has got involved in a number of them as well. But I think they are quite difficult to scale. And the margins are huge. I mean, those crisis M&A firms make probably 40-50% margins. M&A is in the CEO's or CFO's office. No, margin or fee, and then success fees. They get success fees on top of it. So related to quote unquote performance. So I think that's a little bit what's happened. But I would say in COVID, what we've seen is category. There are V-shaped, which is online shopping, healthcare, tech, those areas, online events and that sort of thing. And then there are U-shapes, and then there are sort of flatter U-shapes. The more varied the product categories. So Nestle, Unilever, Procter, more varied. L'Oreal, maybe Colgate, narrower. So their U's are probably a little bit narrower. And then there's the L shape, which are like travel and hospitality. I haven't seen any chair shapes, ones that have gone out of business completely. I think, on a slightly grimmer note, the more chair shaped categories are the small businesses. Those are the ones where you see huge pressure. And I only hope, that they are helped as much, not by government, by the way, but by the big firms giving them credit. I mean, financial credit, acting as bankers for some of these firms. I think in recent agency reviews, I heard of one case, agency reviews, where one of the big holding companies, which I know well, gave 120 days credit. I mean, you just can't do that. I mean, that's crackers. And of course, that puts the smaller companies at an immediate disadvantage.
We're down to about 3 or 4 minutes, so we have to be quick. Yeah. We touched on sort of employment issues in the communications sector, and you raised some concerns there. I'd be remiss, I think, if I didn't ask you a question about diversity and inclusion, right, which obviously has become a higher priority, certainly in the US and the UK, but I think probably globally. Do you agree that that needs to be a priority for our sector? And how proud or otherwise are you of both the industry's record and your own record on those issues over the years?
Well, we, as a firm, S4 is 40% people of color, and we represent, for example, here in America, our Hispanic and Asian populations are within the firm. Reflect the communities. Our objective is to reflect the communities in which we operate in. So in those areas, in the Black population, we're about 5% and growing. We're probably up now to about 6 or 7% because we've changed our hiring policies. But we're heavily in California, which is about 5%. The country is around 13%. And New York, for example, is 25%. So we operate in New York, and we said we want to reflect the communities in which we operate. So we have to do more. But I just want to underline that we have no choice. Whatever you think, and I'll give you one good example. We competed in a big review recently, which we won against the biggest digital agencies. And 40% of the grade, the evaluation grade, was on the diversity of the team. That meant that in that particular pitch, if we didn't have a highly diverse group, which we did, because we're 40% people of color, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't get to first base. Forget about hitting a home run, you just wouldn't get there. So I remember listening to Ken Fraser of Merck, and he said there are 2 ways that you can, after Black Lives Matter movement started really to get traction. This is different to 1968, I think. This is real movement after George Floyd's tragic murder. What we're really talking about is 2 things: hiring practices and education. But the procurement, as Fraser said, the procurement thing is really important. And I think, Paul, to your point, that if we as an industry don't move forward further, we have no choice, because the procurement practices are going to change. Now we're doing education and training. We've changed our hiring policies. We're taking into account that procurement pressure. We've set up a Black fellowship scheme. It was launched last week. So we are taking, like the fellowship scheme that we did at WPP, which I think now they've stopped it, which is really sad. But just like that, we've tailored it totally to the Black community. Now, Black students don't go to university in the proportion that they bear to the population. So it's no good just going to the universities, the Black university, which we are doing, but go to the high school. So we're recruiting. We're starting to interview now. We're getting some really, really, really good candidates. Unfortunately, we won't able to do it on great scale. But, there are other schemes. You've seen that somebody I know very well is involved in the 10,000 Black interns program here in the UK. So it is changing. We have no choice. There is no debate about it. You have to reflect the communities that you operate in. I think this election in America is the last election where the proportion of whites will be greater than 50%. Babies born, the proportion has been greater than 50% non-white for many years. This is the first election, I think, it's true to say, the last election where whites will be the majority.
Okay, thank you very much. ICCO is obviously running a very tight ship here. They started us on time. I think we can be courteous and end on time.
Well, if anybody, Paul, wants to talk to me about anything we talked or not talked about, martin@s4capital.com.
Okay, thank you, Martin. It's always a pleasure. You have a unique perspective on the big issues impacting our business. I'm going to say thank you and hand the conference back to our hosts at ICCO. Thanks very much.
Well, we'll watch the result with great interest. Thank you, Paul.
Bye.
God bless. Thank you very much.